Hello to you all. So I'm going to introduce myself, and I'm going to be one of the co-moderators today. And I work for the organizations of watershed organizations in Quebec, and I'll be taking care of the French part of the meeting today. We're going to do what we can so that it will be as fluid as possible with the languages. And thanks to our interpreters who will be there to help us throughout this discussion. So first off, I would like to invite you to share the objectives of the meeting today. So we want to establish, first off, the foundation. And we want to have exchanges on experiences that have occurred on participatory water science and community management on water. We want to see what we have in common, what are the divergences. So through this dialogue, you will be invited to listen and then to participate eventually. And we're going to explore together these points that we have in common and this reflection that will occur on a pan-Canadian level. So there are two examples that will be presented to you. You will have the definition, and eventually we'll give you links at the end of the presentation. So we'll talk to you about the next steps. All right, so now I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Rebecca and Sebastian, for that wonderful start. My name is Taylor Wilkes. I am a facilitation lead at Our Living Waters. I'm calling in today from Mississauga territory, which we now call Peterborough, Ontario. At Our Living Waters, we center water and our relationship with water in everything that we do. And so I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're all calling in today from watersheds across the continent. And each of those watersheds has its own distinct configuration of original peoples and protocols of that place. Relationships with either unceded or treaty territory, conflict of peoples and activities and change in those places. And so I want to say thank you to everyone who is on this call and takes time to observe their watershed, listen to their watershed, and participate in the work of protecting our waters together. And so Sebastian and I are moderators of our conversation today. We're here on behalf of the Community-Based Water Monitoring Collaborative. This collaborative who's hosting our event today is a combination of about 10 water leaders from across the country, many of whom are here on this call today. And these leaders have been working together from their regional networks or national programs for many years to bolster the national network of participatory science and community-based water monitoring across the country. This event is one of the many things we've done together. And I'll ask Andrew to put a link to the collaborative's website if you're interested to know more about them. This chat is a place where you're welcome to throw a question in along the way as we get going, but we won't be addressing people's questions until the final section of our webinar today. So with that said, Sebastian, I'll pass it back to you to introduce our speakers.
All right. So today, as collaborators and helpers, we have Nathalie and Mathilde from G3E, Quebec organization. And we'll present with you the forum on the science participatory water science. And David and Laura will be here with us as well from Atlantic Water Network, AWN. So they will present to you one of the activities that they have held on community management of water. And then we also have Rebecca Taylor and Sébastien Sauvé, who will be here from the University of Montreal. And then Asline from DataStream, who will also participate. and they are part of the organization and are participating in this session today. Now, should I maybe introduce a bit more this Quebec part of the forum on participatory water science? Why not? So this activity occurred in November of 2022, and it brought together all sorts of players to implement a network on participatory water science with players in the field. So this was about looking to find a vision, a mission, and to implement a action plan. And you'll have the opportunity to get those details a little bit later through the exchanges that we'll have in just a moment. Taylor, are you going to be presenting or introducing those people from the Atlantic?
Nope, that's all you.
Okay. So from with the other project, look, I'm just trying to not fall into all of these explanations because they're going to present to us their approach in community management of water. So I'm not going to go into more details because the participants will be able to present this through their dialogue, and they'll be able to go into more details in their explanations. All right, Nathalie. So if you would like to speak, so it's going to be an exchange. At the beginning, there will be some presentations, one after the other, and then we'll be able to have an exchange, and we'll be able even to deal with questions. So would you like to present to us this event, Nathalie? Talk to us about the forum that happened with the network, and then talk to us about the people that came together. I just want to make sure if you can see the screen. Can you see it? Yes, we can. So, hello. My name is Nathalie Pieboeuf, Director General of the Education Group and Water Management. It's an organization that's based in Quebec, but it works around the province and even beyond. So we work in citizen science projects, communities with youth through organizations. So I would invite you to look at our website for more information. So I'm very pleased today to be able to be here and to talk to you about one of the approaches that has been implemented in Quebec to highlight a participatory water science. This is an approach that was done in collaboration with 4 organizations: the University of Montreal, DataStream, Aero BBQ, and G3E, and thanks to the support of the ECO Foundation. So let's look at semantics a bit. In Quebec, we decided to talk about participatory water science. This is a term that is used in the field with the governments, departments, and on a community level. Participatory science, maybe everyone has their own definition, but why not we look at this and look at the objectives? For us, participatory science is about all action or projects that involve people, citizens, through research. This can go from sampling, identification, analysis, identification of actions that need to be taken. So it's really about this participatory science that we are going to talk to you about today. So how did this all begin? About 3 years ago, well, these 4 organizations came together to talk about participatory science, where things were at, where we wanted to be headed, because at a certain level or at different levels, we were all involved in participatory science. So through discussions, we realized that there were many organizations in Quebec that worked on it, that have done quite a bit with data, and that were spread out throughout Quebec. and that their actions on participatory water science contributed to water management. And obviously that these were great tools to raise awareness amongst citizens. But throughout our discussions, we did ask the question, well, who are the true actors, the organizations who work on participatory water science in Quebec? Because it's really all sectors that are involved: government, research, community groups, groups around the province. So how is data collected? By who? How are they used? Are there limits to the data? And the decision-making powers, do they recognize participatory water science for their just value? So we had these discussions, and we said that the best way to be able to answer all of these questions would be to come together. So the coming together as a group and to look at what activities were being worked on. So the idea came to us to organize a first forum on participatory water science in Quebec. The objective here of the forum was to bring together the players and to be aware that, well, we were aware that we knew that we didn't reach everybody, but we knew that it was a beginning. We wanted to look at the state of affairs with the participants, where we were at, and to see what was happening. And then we also wanted to have a discussion. This was the first time that we came together. And together, our objective was to establish a common vision and to establish an action plan that would support the organization's work, those who worked on participatory water science, and to bring together the efforts of all these people so that we wouldn't have any overlapping, and to make sure that we would all work together given that resources are limited. So as Sebastien was saying, last November, almost a year ago, we held our first participatory water science forum. We were quite pleased with the results and with the participation. So 65 participants from 32 organizations, from NGOs, from different ZIP committees that we have in Quebec. People came from provincial departments, federal departments, research field, universities, and municipalities. The only caveat is that we weren't able to have organizations from Indigenous communities. If we do have a second edition of this forum, well, that would be an element that we are going to try to rectify. So this forum was held over 2 days. The first day was to lay the foundation. So in the morning, we had a presentation from 9 initiatives, projects and activities that came from the university sectors, the government sector. We had presentations on projects that included the participation of young people, citizens, and projects that were about data management. Afterwards, there was a presentation that was quite interesting from Nicole Sabwin, who came to talk to us about their traditional vision and how this knowledge can be integrated in scientific knowledge and in participatory science. Afterwards, the day finished with a panel of 4 people from the communication world who came to talk to us about how we can make science more accessible for citizens. And when we talk about participatory science, of course, this is a key element in order to be able to present this to people, to citizens. Second day was a working day, an intense working day. The objective of that second day, well, they were quite ambitious. We wanted to begin the day by establishing a common vision of what we thought participatory water science was. Through different workshops, we wanted to have an action plan at the end of the day for the 5 to 10 years to come. This was a very ambitious task. And believe it or not, we did come to an action plan at the end of the day. So here is our vision, the vision that we came to together. Of course, this is a vision that will evolve over time, of course, and it'll be a bit more specific with time. So let me read it to you. So in the next few years, we see a network, a participatory water science network for the health of water. It'll be recognized for the sustainable participation of communities, for the diversity of its actors, and for sharing scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge. So after many workshops that led us to the action plan, I would like to present to you this action plan that came about after that day. So our action plan is based on 5 different pillars or points. During the day, there were about 30 different things that came about, and we grouped them up into 5 different sections. These points were translated then into directions and then objectives and 52 actions. So the first point was about the vision. So we want to ensure that through our approach, all of the players agree on a common goal, on a direction, in order to progress with participatory water science. One of the first objectives that we established to get to this point was to really structure the organization. So to see how we were going to work, were the things that we needed to implement in order for us to move ahead. So I'm not going to necessarily read you all of this because it'll be a bit heavy, but the second direction or point was about engagement or participation. So how do we ensure that there is a sustainable participation of youth, citizens, departments, ministries? And so one of the first point was that we needed to know who was involved. We wanted to create a database to see who were those people that worked on participatory water science in Quebec, and then to develop strategies and ways to ensure that we can get new people involved, and also to make sure that those who are already working on this can continue to do the work, and that there's no that they don't get overwhelmed. And we wanted to also recognize the efforts of all people in the activities that are related to participatory science. Third point is about sustainability. So you might think, well, how can we do this to ensure sustainability with these actors? Well, we can look at a financial level, but there's also human resources and materials. This also touches on the participation of all people. One of the objectives that we wanted to have and that we will begin to work on is this idea to implement a funding mechanism. Now, this would be some traditional funding. So we would also think about how we can ensure that there's a sustainable financial part to our activities on participatory science. Now, the fourth point was all about data. So how do we ensure that we recognize the participatory science and to make sure that this data is accepted and used by the different players? So of course, this touches on science rigor, credibility of data. So there'll be different things that will occur that will reinforce this rigor, this credibility to ensure that this data can be used and used properly. Now, the last point was about knowledge sharing. So this is also all about communication and to implement ways that we can share these knowledge and how to make all of this information accessible for citizens, because of course we're talking about participatory science and we want people to understand that they are involved. The objective, of course, here is to protect aquatic bodies. So now I just went over our action plan quite quickly, but I would invite you to visit the information that we'll share with you a little bit later, and read more attentively all of the report that came from the forum. And also, we have the action plan written out, and everything's in French and in English. So please don't hesitate to have a look. So after the forum, and when we wrote the report, the observations that we had in Quebec was that participatory water science is quite alive in Quebec. There are initiatives that are occurring around the province for most of the regions in Quebec. There are many people who are involved in all sectors, be it the government, research, university, community, Indigenous communities as well.
We now have fairly significant databases. There's been work on this being done for 20 years. So it's an interesting data set and a rich data set. At the end of the forum, we heard the desire of the participants to continue. People want to continue this work of participatory science. So that was very encouraging to hear the positive feedback and the desire to go on. We understood that we need to set up an organizing committee to allow us to advance. We have a plan of action, but someone has to implement it. And we don't want to create a new structure to add to all the other structures that already exist in Quebec. So we want to avoid that. So that will be part of our reflections in terms of how we structure ourselves. And then, of course, with our action plan, our little organizing committee, the 4 organizations working together, are working on how to implement, and we are now talking about a collective, structuring a collective for participatory science in Quebec. And what's going to be done up over the next year? Well, structuring this collective, defining its structure, setting it up properly, developing a database of players. We're also going to develop comms tools to promote participatory science that can be shared with the various players, stakeholders, community members. And then initiate the development of a funding mechanism, set up a strategic committee, and draw up an implementation plan. So that's all part of what's coming up for us. So I thank you very much for listening, for your attention, and I would be very happy to discuss all of this with you, to hear your questions and comments. Sébastien Sauvé is also here, and Sébastien Continé as well can share their points of view on the forum and the approach in Quebec to this kind of work. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Natalie. That was really, really exciting to see. And I'm already drawing some similarities and differences between our work. I'm excited to get into those later. An introduction for me, I'm going to share my screen, but my name's Laura Chandler, and I'm a program manager with Atlantic Water Network. Just going to share my screen and make sure everyone can see. All good? I'm a program manager with Atlantic Water Network. I've been there for about 4 years now. And today I wanted to get into how we as a network support such a diverse range of community members. So a little bit about Atlantic Water Network for those who aren't familiar. We are Atlantic Canada's hub for community-based water monitoring. And we share a common vision, which is already a similarity, that Atlantic rivers, lakes, and wetlands are healthy and stewarded by local communities in the long term. So we support our network in a few different ways, and one of those is network building, shared learning, and then technical supports. So community-based water monitoring is really our bread and butter. And what I mean by this is water monitoring that is driven by community concerns, objectives, and capacity. But I'll get into this a bit later. This changes a little bit throughout our network as well. So our first pillar is network building. we have a huge network of over 100 community partners throughout Atlantic Canada. This ranges from Indigenous and environmental groups, researchers, governments. We really like to foster that interprovincial collaboration. And then bringing those Atlantic concerns to a national level. Conversations like these are a great place to start. Our second pillar is shared learning. So we want to facilitate as much resource sharing between our network as possible. We have an online certification course in water monitoring. We have in-field and online community-based water monitoring training. We really want to make sure that the communities that we work with are collecting the highest quality data that they can, so that it's usable down the road. And then we like to offer technical supports. So we have free water monitoring equipment hubs in all over the maritime provinces. We host data analysis, management, communication workshops, and we're the regional partner for Atlantic Data Stream, which I'm sure most of you know by now is an open access water quality data hub. I'll get into how we really, really value them to support our decision-making work in a little bit. So, like I said, Atlantic Canada, it's huge. We have so many communities here. There's, the rocky coastlines of Nova Scotia, red sand beaches in PEI, mountains and fjords in Newfoundland and Labrador, and forested hills in New Brunswick. So really, such diverse landscape. And that comes with a whole slew of unique challenges that are very specific to a lot of locations that we work with. But we have a strength here, and that is that we have diverse communities. So we're really lucky to have so many different types of communities and sizes of communities that we work with. Each group we work with brings such a fresh perspective and expertise. But that also gives us a little bit of a challenge. So working with such a diverse network, each of our communities have different capacities, priorities, and access. So we work with watershed groups that could be run by a single volunteer to groups who have 50 full-time staff members. And because of this, that I alluded to earlier, community-based water monitoring looks very different for everyone. So this leads us to the question of how do we prioritize our support if our network is so big and so different? And the answer to that for now is data and listening. And then the data has a bit of listening in it, and the listening has a bit of data in it. So first, I want to touch on some work that we did a couple of years ago. I'm going to call this our data sufficiency analysis. So this was inspired by WWF's watershed reports, now put on by Water Rangers, which told us that much of Atlantic Canada doesn't have enough water quality data to determine watershed health. So we took to Atlantic Data Stream, which many of the communities that we work with upload their data to. And we started to dig through this data at a finer sub watershed level to figure out who's collecting data, where they're collecting data, why they're collecting data, and then ultimately how we can support them in that process. So we asked the question, how much data is enough data? And if you ask 50 different organizations, you'll get 50 different answers. So for one group, it might be, we collect 4 different parameters 6 times per year. For another group, they might say, we really care about temperature, so we just want to look at temperature monitored every single hour. So we wanted to be able to make our problem solving a little bit more adaptable to these different situations. So then we made maps that highlighted a couple of these different situations that we talked about with our partners, and tried to determine where there was enough data to be making these decisions and which areas needed our support a little bit more. So what we found was that sufficient watersheds really have these tight, coordinated, community-based water monitoring efforts. Their governments were uploading their data openly and accessibly, and insufficient watersheds. Sometimes that data existed, but groups just didn't have the capacity to make sure it was enough or available. And a lot of times it's project-based funding, which leads to inconsistent collection of data. So this work really helped us prioritize where we support. And then to figure out how, we took to our communities. We did a little bit of a ground truthing roadshow. We had meetings, we went on road trips, and we asked a lot of questions to figure out how we can support these different regions in different ways. So, for example, sufficient data, but not open data, we can help this with technical expertise and data management support. Those regions with data that they had data, but it wasn't sufficient, we can help a group rework their watershed monitoring based on new knowledge, or offer them equipment that'll get them the parameters that they need to monitor. And then regions without monitoring programs, we can help raise awareness and work on our outreach in those locations to target new folks and get them on board and get new programs off the ground. So this really came down to not only meeting over Zoom or phone calls, but like hitting the road, getting in the stream with our partners, putting the waders on and having a conversation in a river, meeting up for a beer on a dock somewhere. These conversations were the ones that were so important to us and that we couldn't have had over Zoom. So it's really crucial for building that trust for us and getting the answers to these questions. So now that we had a little bit of a foundation, we took to our network a bit more broadly. We host a network meeting every year. And at this one in 2021, we held a little bit of a community needs assessment to determine what's working, what's not, what are some hangups, and what are some opportunities. So this is our lovely network. Lots of you are here today. I'm really happy to see you here. And we worked together on a bit of a needs assessment, did a survey of our network, and we were able to answer a few of these questions about how we can do better for our network. One thing I also want to highlight that helps me with my decision-making is turning to our shared values. So as part of our strategic planning process a couple of years ago, we identified some values. And I really do look to these to help me when I have to make a trickier decision. So for instance, humility. As network leaders, I'm far removed from the actual work that's happening on the ground in the watersheds. So I have to trust our communities, trust that they know their watersheds best and they know what's right for their communities. That way we can develop resources that they actually will use. Inclusion. So when deciding to make a resource that might support one of those 50-person staffed organizations versus a volunteer organization, we want to make sure that the little and often overlooked groups in our network are feeling supported. So that helps us a little bit in our decision making as well. Collaboration, it's our job to bring together our network, and as I mentioned before, and as Natalie mentioned in her network, like they're full of experts. So bringing together our experts with these newer groups really helps everyone get the support that they need. And then reflexivity also kind of goes a bit with humility, is that needs change and priorities change and the climate changes. So we have to change as well. And we can do that really quickly, which is kind of where we're well placed a little bit. So what we've done so far, as I mentioned, we did strategic planning. We ran water monitoring boot camps in these insufficient watersheds. We've developed a couple new equipment hubs in more remote communities that couldn't access our main hubs. And we've helped some of these groups with data management and upload support for DataStream to make their data accessible. And then what's to come? So more capacity building, regular needs assessments, regular checking in with our communities, coordination of our partners so that they can work together better, but then also coordination of their resources so that we all know where to go to get the resources that we need. And then long-term support as well. So I hope with this presentation, I got the point across that really meaningful listening and learning helps us prioritize our support. So meeting our communities where they're at to learn more about what they need from us. And then being able to strategically support our network really helps strengthen our diverse network. So thank you to our supporters and thank you for listening. I'm really excited to get into the dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. It's great to have an opportunity to take the time to listen to what's happening in both of your programs. You can tell, thank you for showcasing each of your case studies. As we can see, Natalie, there is so much activity happening in Quebec, bringing these groups together and learning together how to network and add more structure to your network and relationships. On the East Coast in Atlantic Canada, we have this really established, well set up network already functioning. You're at different stages of this form of collaboration. And so you have different relationships coming to the table. One of the key goals of the community-based water monitoring collaborative is to find ways to bring francophone voices, the leaders of participatory sciences in Quebec, to the table and make more space for voices that have been historically less represented in this work. And so events like today is a new opportunity in our working professional community. And so we'd like to invite two of these, of Laura and Natalie's colleagues, to have a dialogue today. Sébastien Sauvé is a professor in environmental chemistry at the University of Montreal. And Sébastien worked closely with Natalie in the development and design of the forum that she just presented about. As well, Aislinn Livingstone is a close colleague of Laura Chandler's from previously working at Atlantic Water Network. Aislinn is currently the water program manager at DataStream. And Aislinn has been an anchor of national network building in CBWM, in community-based water monitoring. And she's been part of the collaborative and been able to witness this emergence of cross-cultural bilingual relationship building that we've been focusing on in the last while, and that they are working really hard at DataStream to continue. And so it's not often that the opportunity comes where we have space for informal conversations at work. This next section of our webinar is unstructured and playful. We're going to invite these four friends and colleagues to just talk amongst themselves about what it's been like in the past while to collaborate and learn from each other across place and discipline and culture. So with that said, we have about 15-20 minutes for these people to speak, and then we'll move into questions and answers afterwards.
So I'm going to dive in. Thank you very much for the introductions. It's really wonderful to see all this work going on. One of the elements that I really appreciate in participatory science is how we improve dialogue between different groups and between different communities. There are a lot of examples here that integrate or involve different community groups that work together, come from different realities on science. And I think dialogue in science is so important. What responds to the needs? How can science be better perceived? How can I dialogue better with all these different stakeholders, community groups, organizations, and so on? I'm not sure, was that a question? Was it a comment? I think it's very interesting what you're getting at. And I think that is the major challenge we have with participatory science, this dialogue between fundamental research and the how to involve citizens at the ground, on the ground, how to do education, popular education, scientific education, so that from your teens on, you have a basic foundation in this kind of participatory science. Also reinforcing confidence, trust in the citizenry. Science can also scare and intimidate citizens. A lot of Canadians are timid or nervous. They don't feel they have the capacity to participate. So inspiring that trust and opening doors and making people feel that they can get involved. It's just like anything new. We learn as we go along, and this is very important for academics, for researchers in the university sector. There's of course an exercise in vulgarizing, in making accessible the language and the ideas, which is not always natural for researchers and academics. So there's work on both sides, and I believe deeply that we can achieve this and get more citizens involved in this kind of participatory science.
From our perspective, I have also seen examples, Nathalie and Sébastien, where academics and researchers are making a huge effort to communicate the science results of studies happening in academic institutions to communities that research is affecting, and vice versa. Organizations like Atlantic Water Network, G3E, Water Rangers, and probably a handful of others in this webinar who are also kind of bridging the gap in science literacy training through lots of great resources in English and in French. So, and just from our perspective, working at the national level, there's sort of this collision of those two things happening at once. And, we see it manifested in the results of these collaborations when people are sharing data from those collaborations, but also just when, we're on the ground, listening to networking events like these and participating in workshops. So just from my perspective, I'm seeing that those two gaps are being bridged in a really nice way in the different regions that DataStream's working. I wanted to kind of pick your brains on one of the themes that came up today, and that was this strength. And I was reading through the forum in English. Thank you for that, by the way. But this strength in these experts in your network. So, for instance, we have tons and tons of community experts who could be just the person that somebody else is looking for, who they'd be willing to help each other, but they just don't know how to get involved with one another. So it's kind of a problem that we're thinking about trying to solve. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts about moving forward to try and connect these experts to the people who could use them? Yeah, we're toying with like mentorship or different advisory committees or like something formal or something informal.
It's a very good question. I don't think there's an easy answer. At the forum in Quebec City, when we held the forum, what was really precious was having all of those people in the same room. So and in the corridors there was all kinds of contact and exchanges and dialogue and ideas about how to advance together. But how do we facilitate in the future? How do we maintain those connections? A website can be a bit simplistic. Do we organize an annual conference? That can be a bit heavy in terms of the structures and the logistics. Committees, as an academic, a professor, I'm on lots of committees already, so I don't really need more committees in my life. So are they discussion forums? I don't really have one answer, but I think there needs to be a dialogue, and we need to have different dialogues on different dimensions of these issues, and that we, as you say, foster these links and these relationships and these dialogues. I think that in the approach that we've already carried out to identify what are the activities of participatory science already taking place on the ground at the community level in each of our milieus is a good starting point, having this inventory, because we realized at the forum that we had invited a number of people, a number of individuals, but there were others that we forgot to invite, or we didn't even realize existed or were out there. And we found that out from people who were at the forum, that there were other groups doing participatory science that we weren't even aware of. So I think that it's a little bit like what Sébastien said. We can't be fearful of speaking to each other, of calling people up. I've already done this in my projects. Sometimes through word of mouth, we hear about a certain expert and we pick up the phone, and sometimes we're very pleasantly surprised by the reaction. People are just often waiting to be contacted. We don't realize that. So not being fearful, not being nervous to approach organizations, to propose certain research projects. Like Sébastien said, there's not one solution. There's not one size fits all. There are many different solutions, many different possible pathways that we can follow. So it's honing in on those different solutions, and it's by talking to each other, by exchanging, that we can figure out how to better collaborate. Absolutely.
That's a great point. I find that all like the best connections are made when you don't even know that they exist. So for instance, because of this work that I did, Aislinn and I took a road trip to Cape Breton, and we met so many wonderful groups, and every group had a new name for us to phone up that day. So we were in the car calling new people, arranging new meetings, hopping in another stream, meeting so many people that we just didn't know existed, which was very exciting.
Yeah, I guess I just want to add to your question and the points that Natalie and Sébastien have made about how to sort of strengthen peer networking and connect experts and communities with each other. We've really seen this just by virtue of working with regional networks like Atlantic Water Network, G3E, are doing something similar in Quebec, in other hub regions where data stream works that are really based on regional partnerships like Winnipeg Basin, as well as in the Mackenzie Basin. We see those connections being made, and we've heard that there's demand for data sharing and infrastructure for people to share their data, but it's so much harder when we don't have connectors like your organizations to facilitate those relationships that are already existing and have been forged, years in advance around common concerns and themes that people are working on in their watersheds. So that's just something that we've observed when you're starting fresh in a new hub region and there isn't somebody to provide those connections, that it looks a lot different when there's already existing momentum, like in Atlantic Canada, whether that's jumping into a stream, Laura, or attending a workshop or a webinar. So yeah, I do think that the work that G3E is doing with others to establish this this collective and collaborative, kind of more formalizing what's already happening on the ground, seems like a really great next step, because the work is already being done. And I wasn't at that forum in Quebec last fall, but I heard that there was a ton of energy in the room, that people were already thinking about collaboration opportunities before the thing even had a name. So yeah, I do think I'm really excited to see what comes out of that, and how we can support it in Quebec specifically.
Perhaps a comment on that, if I might. You know, it was pretty flagrant in Quebec City to see that there were many people who had initiatives, different initiatives, but all quite similar. A lot of efforts being done, data gathering and so on. There's a lot to be gained from being more efficient, from collaborating and sharing ideas and best practices. Everyone's looking for resources for funding. We have everything to gain from collaborating more and being more efficient, and not all competing, inefficiently for the same resources.
At this point in the recording, there was a small technical issue with the translation, and so people listening in English were not able to hear the translation from French into English, but the question revolved around the implementation of the network at the beginning. So how Atlantic Water Network started and how people came together to work together at the very beginning of the network.
My apologies, I missed the translation on that one.
Sorry, there was a problem with the channels. The question was, how did you come together as a group with the network, AWN?
How did we come together as a group? So, like, for our network meeting. For our network meeting specifically, they've all been online since. How did the network begin? Oh gosh, that's a question that is well beyond my time. Atlantic Water Network has been around in some way, shape, or form since 2004, and it actually started as a research project out of St. Mary's University. So a researcher was working on how community groups can better monitor their environment. And then out of that grew Atlantic Water Network. So we saw a need specifically for the support for water monitoring in Atlantic Canada, and we ran with that.
Did the group also include departments, municipalities, and decision-making organizations?
Yeah.
In a lot of the conversations they were a part of and the work that we're seeing across Canada, I guess just following up on that theme, Natalie, there is a high level of collaboration, not just locally within and between community-based monitoring groups, but also across sectors as well. So, you know, if we're getting to the point where people are asking how they can share their data, that's one thing, but usually it comes from, and I might have mentioned this earlier, concerned community groups, CBWM organizations, community scientists working with a research lab or with a local government. It could be a municipal government, it could be provincial government to collect data and share it and compare what they're finding in their watershed with other regions as well. So AWN's network, I think, is very clear in this way, working with different levels of government across all the Atlantic provinces, but also with every type of community-based monitoring organization in their various shapes and forms, whether it's, you know, one retired researcher or an Indigenous-led monitoring program, or, you know, a project that emerged from a university group. So yeah, it's really great to see groups kind of bridging silos and sectors and watersheds and working together, and AWN certainly facilitates that.
I have a question, and maybe maybe this is more of like a research-oriented question for Sebastian. But we always have communities asking us, great, I've collected the data. I know like what's going on in my watershed, but how can this be used in a further way that's bigger than just our community group? So what do we need to do to make sure that governments are looking at this or researchers are using this data? Aislinn, I know that you also keep tabs on who's using data stream data. And I think that like having our network, so many people use data stream has been such a cool way for groups to compare data with each other. But how do they go that one step further?
Well, I think that researchers all have an approach that is quite personal when they research and when they have interests in research. But this is an approach that is opportunistic, meaning, well, at least my scientific research is opportunistic. And I'm looking for the opportunities and the research projects that would be the most interesting ones. So the best way that can serve research, well, it would be that researchers know first off that this information is available. They would have to find ways to obtain it and to use it. And maybe there would have to be a dialogue in the next analyses that will be done, because maybe there's missing a little something, or maybe there's more information that would be easy to get that would be more useful for certain researchers. So researchers need to know that there is a lot of people, a lot of researchers, and they are quite organized. So maybe our dialogue here would be able to be something that can help, and maybe I can help. Look, I can't do everything. I think we would have to have a dialogue with the people who are on the ground. And that would maybe be like presence from people, from citizens that would present and that would show what is being done. And I think we have all to gain from this. Because as a researcher, for me to have access to this data, that is quite precious. And it enables me to have a bigger research project. But these are all different data that what I would obtain myself in my lab. So researchers need to know. That would be the first step. We need to see how we can improve the dialogue. And that's what I really liked from Quebec. But also, it's too bad that all of these activities that occur were occurring, but I didn't know what was happening. So we'd have to speak a bit more. We would have to find mechanisms so that we have more of a dialogue.
I wanted to just share a couple of examples, Laura, because you gave me the string, so I'm going to pull it, of what we're seeing in terms of data use across some of the hub regions. So, I mean, I don't need to say this. Obviously, monitoring is really expensive. It's time consuming. So people aren't doing it. I mean, some people are doing it for fun, but also because they want the data to be used in different ways, either by community or local decision makers. And we've arrived sort of at a critical mass across some hub regions where there's enough data that we're now seeing it being applied in different ways. So it's really, really exciting from our perspective to see that how the data is having real world impacts on the ground at different scales. So, I mean, Laura, you presented one example, which was the data sufficiency analysis. That was an example of how data was used to identify where there might be gaps in data collection and how to pinpoint where the greatest opportunities are to invest resources and training and that type of thing. And I've heard anecdotally that there are other organizations that are looking to do similar work across Canada. We've also seen examples of the data being used by governments to develop modeling tools and also to inform some of the studies that they're conducting with researchers and communities on the ground, as well as policy programs. And we're seeing examples of where academics are using community-based monitoring data for long-term studies. There's an example of a researcher at Mount Allison University, and they've collected over 20 years of data from Environment Climate Change Canada, but also by community-based monitoring organizations. And there's enough data there that they can analyze it for long-term trends. So it's just really exciting to see how the data is being used in different ways, in different places, and that it is having real tangible impacts. So that is something, it sounds like others are interested in this as well. I would love to hear from people in this webinar and on the call, how they're seeing data have real impact, with the knowledge that, it's not just, the desire isn't for it just to sit on a website or in a repository. So Natalie and Laura, I don't know if there are any examples that you've come across that you find very inspiring, or Sebastien, going with this thread.
So at different levels, so I'm going to speak more for the G3E, where we have a network, and we have different partners, different participants throughout Quebec. So there are many organizations that participate in this data. And yes, they do acquire this data. This data is useful for water management, for understanding the impacts. And they can also improve the direction for conservation of waterways. So yes, these data is not all about, not only about acquiring the data, but it's important, of course, that it's used. So there are many examples, of course, of how these data are being used. And we are currently working on climate change, and we're looking at seeing how these tools can be used for adaptation plans for climate change, to have data collected by people, by citizens, how this can be used in our plans to combat climate change. So we can't just collect data for the sake of it, but we need to make sure that this is used by people who make decisions. And of course, that's very important. So to come back a little bit on the research aspect, well, it's all about dialogue, yes. We just finished a research project with one of the universities that used all of our data, and the researcher worked in that field. So it was about meeting them, and it's a win-win situation, because you're able to move ahead together. So there you have it. That's my point of view. I don't know if Sebastien wanted to add anything. Well, what I would add, the value of collaboration goes beyond the data that is collected. I believe that it's precious. It's very important to have people who participate and who will collect samples, and they will send us these samples that we'll be able to analyze them in the lab. And these are things that wouldn't have otherwise have been able to be to get done. So there are many different ways. We need to highlight all of these data, and dialogue is what is precious. Yeah, just to jump on that idea, we have a huge education sector. A lot of our projects involve youth. And I think it's something that we can't forget. Of course, a 12-year-old who collects data has maybe less scientific value. And we do need to make sure how we go about that. But it is also about education and developing a culture, social participation. This is a huge aspect. And I think this is also what participatory water science is. It's not only about data, but it's also about developing knowledge, respecting the environment. And that is something that can be implemented. So participatory science and community science, it's much more than just collecting data. And that's where we see the beauty in the work that we're doing. And no, go ahead, Sébastien, you can finish off, but I just wanted to interject and say something after. Actually, Nathalie, I hope that one day, one of these young people will come and find you at the university, and they will have become a researcher because of a project that you were able to work on. Yes, exactly. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about hope, to talk about the network that is getting bigger. And I love that idea that you talked about. You talked about dialogue. And this is what we're proposing today. We are coming back to the real essence of what exchanges bring. So we're going to make this bigger. So there were 4 of you. And what we're going to do, we're going to now go Canada-wide with all of the other participants. Now, for this to work well, I saw that there are some people here, and I think that there's a Gordon here with us, someone who raised their hand. So we're going to go with one hand up and to get these questions, and people are also writing questions in. So many people will be helping us to get these questions. So we're going to try to alternate between questions with raised hands in the order that they appear.
So I will hand things over to Gordon. Perhaps you could identify yourself, name the community or the organization you represent. So Gordon, go ahead with your question.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the talk. It's been very entertaining and informative. My company is Land-Based Learning. I work with wildlife acoustics. I work with many First Nations territories around Canada. My question is, one of the stumbling blocks I come across is data costs money. So the last time I picked up a solid YSI multimeter, it cost me $10,000. So when we're collecting data and we're getting other people to collect data, even a $50 dip pen, you know, how would you suggest, or how have you seen collaborations come together to support people to collect the data? And my other question would be, if anybody's ever visited the USGS website, the United States Geologic Survey, it's phenomenal. It is so full of data that you can look at their groundwater, flows of streams and creeks across the country. Canada has really dropped the ball here. So now we're all here fumbling around trying to say, how do we share this data? Can we not put pressure on the federal government to provide a portal for us to contribute and collaborate together? I think that might be a solid answer to our dilemma here.
Yeah, I can speak a bit to what we're doing in Atlantic Canada about the equipment issue, because yes, equipment is expensive. Here at Atlantic Water Network, we have about 5 equipment banks across the maritime provinces where community groups can borrow YSIs and other monitoring equipment free of charge. The issue really for a lot of groups comes with transportation though. It's expensive to go out and get in your car, get volunteers in their car, especially with the rising price of gas, to go around to so many different sites. So we have a fairly good equipment sharing system here, but funding is still needed for water quality monitoring specifically.
So we heard one question. Laura took the lead in answering, but Sébastien, Nathalie, Aislinn, you can also complete with your own answers if you want to. If not, we can move on to the next question. Yes, go ahead, Sébastien. Yeah, my little addition would be that university collaboration can help a lot with equipment. Buying small pieces of equipment for us is pretty easy to fund, to finance. We have the budgets for that on campus. And we can also, allow this equipment in some cases to be used off campus and be shared with other groups. But, research is often planned over a 3-year cycle. A long grant for research would be 5 years. So we probably shouldn't depend on these kinds of grants for our day-to-day functioning. But in terms of buying equipment, if there's a project that could allow us to purchase certain specific measurement equipment, that could be done, I think, with the universities, especially if we're talking about pieces of equipment that are, sort of in the $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 range. So that's one hint that might help. But the comparison with the USGS, that's a difficult comparison to make. There are political considerations in Canada around what is federal jurisdiction, what is provincial jurisdiction. The provinces often say to the feds, you don't do enough. The feds say to the provinces, you don't do enough. There's a whole political dynamic to that in Canada. So that lack of data, that's why there are so many citizens getting involved on the ground, because they see that the government isn't doing it. If the government was doing it, then we would use their data if it was good data, and we wouldn't have to, we would do other things with our lives. Yes, so let's continue. Catherine raised her hand, and then we will Catherine Paquette from WWF Canada. A question for Aislinn. At WWF, in terms of our work in watersheds, we've been working with DataStream, but I'm, given that Quebec is a new region for you and for your work, have you noticed some differences or some new tendencies there, the way data is shared in Quebec, the way groups collaborate or work together? Have you noticed any differences in the Quebec case? So that question's for you, Aislinn, I believe.
Hey, Catherine, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. And so, yeah, our work in Quebec is new. Our Great Lakes Data Stream launched last fall, and we actually dovetailed the kickoff of Great Lakes Data Stream with the forum in Quebec that Natalie presented on. But I've actually invited my colleague Charlotte. She's joined me on this webinar, and I'm going to let her take this question. So Charlotte is a data specialist with DataStream, and she's really leading the outreach and work that we're doing in Quebec. So Charlotte, if you don't mind, I'll let you take this one. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question, Catherine. My name is Charlotte. I work with DataStream, and I'm working with groups in Quebec and in the Atlantic region as well, both in English and in French. And as Aislinn said, currently there are groups throughout Canada sharing data on water quality on the DataStream platform, including a number of Quebec groups. Currently, we're focusing on the technical support agreement to help groups to upload their data online. We have a number of resources on the website for that. If not, we work with a lot of different participatory science groups, watershed organizations, and we're also trying to beef up our collaboration network. We're seeing more and more kinds of collaboration between different measurement and surveillance water monitoring initiatives in Quebec. If you have data that you want to share on DataStream, please get in touch with me. I'd be very, very happy to work with you. Thank you very much for the question.
Wonderful. We have another question here from Lori at Alberta Eco Trust. Lori is curious, Natalie, who led the initial convening in Quebec. What was their interest to get the ball rolling for this network building initiative of the forum? She's also interested to know whether there are any issues or concerns around the transparency of data and any political issues around that with respect to land use and industry. Is this an issue in your networks? And if so, how is it managed?
I will answer a part of that anyway. In terms of the forum itself, we were able to sit down. I'm trying to remember. We collaborated with the University of Montreal, Sébastien Sauvé. We had a project that involved developing partnerships with groups doing participatory science projects. And at the end of our discussions on all of that, that's where we came up with the idea that we became conscious of the fact that there were a lot of organizations in the field and the milieu. And we started to ask questions about how they were all doing their data collection and how we could better coordinate the work and how we could put different organizations in touch with each other. The different watershed organizations across Quebec, we invited them to participate in our discussion, also with a data stream that was beginning its involvement in Quebec and its initiative in Quebec. So following a lot of discussions and dialogue questions, that's where we decided that to answer a lot of these questions, we needed to all come together. We needed people and organizations to come together who are doing this work, this participatory science work. And our idea, as Sébastien said, is not only to have organizations, but we want to put academics, ministries, government agencies, community organizations all together in the same room to discuss. And that's where the idea was born. And really, we organized it not really knowing how well it was going to work because it was the first time. We didn't know whether there would even be that much interest, whether there would be a good turnout, and so on. So we were very pleasantly surprised by the success of the forum. It showed that there's a lot of interest in collaborating more, and it's very encouraging. So that's the forum and how the collective came about, and I think we're going to continue absolutely because there has been so much interest and we don't want to lose this momentum now that we've got the ball rolling. So in terms of data, those questions are a bit more political. I don't know whether one of the Sébastiens wants to answer, perhaps with regards to the initiation of all of this. As Nathalie was saying, I was surprised by the enthusiasm of folks in Quebec City. Like Nathalie, I didn't know exactly what we were getting ourselves into, and I was really pleasantly surprised by the enthusiasm in that room at that forum. In terms of data, it's pretty easy for community data, group data that is acquired, that's pretty simple to evaluate. In most cases, it's pretty simple to share. But where I have much more reticence and where things are a lot more complicated is when it's data shared by municipalities, by cities, or acquired by government organizations. It should be shared and more transparent and easily accessible, but it often isn't, unfortunately. And so it's harder. And the more sensitive it is, if we're talking about pH, that's not that sensitive. But if we're talking about lead in water or specific contaminants in water, I always detect a lot more hesitancy, reticence from government officials to share that data. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to. So I'm wondering whether anyone else has anything to add to that. Yes, this will allow me to get ahead a bit because we're coming to the end. Around water, there are a number of different levels. We have a number of different levels of government, different political levels that have to dialogue and try to harmonize their approaches and how they do their work. This kind of networking, then this dialogue that we're engaged in today, that is trying to have a multi-level approach. Of course, we have to be aware of the political realities in this country. I think there's an awakening around open data, and the infrastructure for that can be expensive to set up. So once governments harmonize and we're all kind of working and are all on the same page, I think it'll be a lot easier to do. But we need to, I think, intensify the work. So I'm going to start to conclude because we're getting to the end, unfortunately. I thought we still had another half hour, but we don't. We're almost finished here. But it's good that we wanted it to go on because that means that shows the interest. It's always good to be left wanting more. We're seeing all these different ideas emerge, and we've heard different elements brought forward. So what I've understood is the importance of dialogue, the importance of organizing it, doing it, not anticipating, not drawing conclusions beforehand, being really open about what might happen. I'm going to hand things over to Taylor because I think Our Living Waters is going to talk about what they plan to do as a follow-up to this webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sebastian, and all of our panelists and speakers and conversationalists today. It's really exciting to see this space come together. At Our Living Waters, we have a few more bilingual conversations in mind that are brewing for the future, so stay tuned for more of this kind of event to come. The community-based water monitoring collaborative will be in touch with some sort of summary or follow-up response that you can see in an Our Living Waters e-news email sometime in the next month or two, and so you will hear more from us. And this is just, these two case studies are representative of participatory science initiatives across the whole country. And so there is activity in BC through Living Lakes Canada and in Winnipeg through the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. And so if this is a helpful conversation, perhaps there can be more cross-Canada conversations to come. Thank you all for coming, and I hope this was valuable use of everyone's time today. And Sebastian, if you have any last words, otherwise we'll say adieu.
Yes, continue to dialogue. That's what we're doing here. Let's spread the good news and continue to dialogue in this way. This is just the beginning, I think.
Okay, wonderful. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.